But Black Americans have seen their jobless rate jump even faster. At 7.5%, they currently face the highest unemployment rate of any racial group, higher than the white population at 3.7%, higher than Asians at 3.6%. Both groups have jobless rates, by the way, which are below the overall population unemployment rate of 4.3%. But if you dig deeper, the sharpest spike even there is happening among Black women.
What happens when the backbone of America's workforce, Black women, suddenly find themselves jobless at record rates? That's exactly what's happening now, and the numbers are staggering. Representative Ayanna Pressley has sounded the alarm, accusing Trump's economic policies of gutting federal jobs and dismantling protections that once kept Black communities afloat. Why are Black women paying the heaviest price in Trump's America? Let's find that out. The shock in Washington is not about Wall Street volatility or another budget standoff. This time, it's about the quiet devastation hitting Black women across America. Representative Ayanna Pressley has stepped forward with a demand that could reshape how the Federal Reserve measures its duty, investigate why unemployment among Black women has spiked so sharply under Trump's presidency, and explain what will be done about it. Her letter to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell pulls no punches. Pressley accuses the administration of fueling an employment crisis by cutting deep into the federal workforce and dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives that once provided at least a thin buffer against systemic bias. In her view, these moves are not isolated decisions. They are part of an intentional pattern designed to erode economic pathways for Black families. Recent data gives her case undeniable weight. Job losses have accumulated in agencies where Black women have historically found opportunities, such as administrative offices, postal services, and clerical divisions that keep government machinery running. These were not glamorous jobs, but they offered security, stable pay, pensions, health benefits, and for many, the first real chance at upward mobility. Now, as pink slips arrive in waves, that foundation is cracking. What makes the situation even more alarming is the timing. America's broader job market, though unsettled, is not in freefall. White unemployment remains relatively steady. In some industries, hiring continues. Yet for Black women, the story is inverted. Unemployment lines grow longer, savings accounts shrink, and career progress vanishes overnight. Pressley warns that this is not just an economic blip. It is a targeted unraveling of progress that took decades to achieve. Her challenge to the Federal Reserve is as strategic as it is symbolic. The Fed's dual mandate includes maximum employment, but historically, that responsibility has been measured in broad averages. Pressley insists that averages hide disparities, and that failing to address racial and gender inequities means the Fed is not fulfilling its mission. How can maximum employment exist, she argues, if the women holding entire communities together are pushed out of the workforce at record speed? The backdrop to her alarm is Trump's broader economic agenda. From the campaign trail to the Oval Office, he has styled himself as a champion of efficiency in government. But efficiency, under his definition, has meant aggressive downsizing. Entire departments have been hollowed out, programs shuttered, and jobs erased. For those outside Washington, these moves are often sold as cost-cutting reforms. But Pressley points out who is actually paying the cost: Black women, who have historically turned to federal employment as one of the few reliable ladders into the middle class. And then there's the deliberate rollback of DEI programs. Under Trump, executive orders and policy shifts have wiped away protections that fostered fairer hiring and promotion practices. For many Black women, these initiatives were not extras. They were lifelines, mechanisms that allowed them to compete in systems tilted against them. Without those safeguards, old barriers are returning in force. Promotions dry up, hiring pools shrink, and biases reassert themselves unchecked. Pressley's call for action is not only about data, it's about dignity. By pressing the Fed, she forces the question of whether America's financial institutions are willing to confront systemic inequities or whether they will allow them to deepen in silence. In doing so, she exposes a deeper hypocrisy, a government that touts economic recovery while discarding the very people who have long kept its wheels turning. Her move is also a warning shot across the political landscape. If Trump's economic policies can dismantle decades of fragile progress so quickly, what else might be undone in a second wave of austerity? And if the Fed refuses to act, what signal does that send to millions of families watching their stability evaporate? The stage is set for a battle that goes beyond employment statistics. At its core, this is about whether America is willing to recognize Black women not as expendable cogs in its machinery, but as indispensable drivers of its future. But what exactly in Trump's policies created this surge in unemployment, and why has the fallout been so devastating for one group above all others? When Representative Ayanna Pressley demanded answers from the Federal Reserve, she wasn't pointing to vague trends or broad economic cycles. She was pointing to a set of deliberate policy choices under Donald Trump that have translated into a targeted economic blow for Black women. To understand why unemployment in this demographic has spiked so dramatically, we have to unpack the architecture of Trump's economic playbook, one that presents itself as cost-saving reform but functions as a scalpel cutting into the very heart of Black stability. The first pillar of that playbook is the aggressive downsizing of the federal workforce. Trump's administration has been unapologetic in slashing agency budgets and trimming staff. Agencies that once employed large numbers of Black women, such as the Department of Education, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Social Security Administration, have been thinned out to skeleton crews. The justification is framed as reducing bureaucracy and streamlining government. But the reality on the ground is that thousands of Black women who once relied on these jobs for steady wages are left without a safety net. Federal employment has historically been more than just a paycheck. It offered benefits, pensions, and pathways to advancement in ways the private sector often denied to Black workers. Stripping these jobs away doesn't just affect individuals. It dismantles one of the only reliable pipelines to the middle class for an entire community. Trump's cuts, in effect, didn't just reduce government overhead. They gutted an ecosystem that had helped generations of Black families climb above poverty. The second pillar is the systematic rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI initiatives. These programs were far from perfect, but they were crucial. They created mentorship opportunities, monitored hiring practices for bias, and encouraged agencies to open doors for historically marginalized groups. For Black women, who faced the compounded barriers of both race and gender, these protections often meant the difference between being overlooked and being promoted. Trump's administration, however, framed DEI as political overreach. Executive orders curtailed funding for training, eliminated accountability mechanisms, and disbanded offices that were tasked with ensuring fairness. In doing so, the administration effectively reintroduced the old status quo, one where biases went unchecked, leadership pipelines dried up, and Black women were again forced to navigate workplaces that did not see them as equals. Another factor feeding the crisis is Trump's broader ideological approach to governance. His rhetoric often pits federal employees against the general public, portraying them as overpaid, underworked, and dispensable. This narrative primes the political stage for cuts, but it also reinforces stigma against the very workers being laid off. For Black women, the message is especially brutal. The state not only discards your labor, but also diminishes your worth. Even outside the federal sector, the ripple effects of these policies are evident. Private companies, watching the federal government retreat from DEI, have been emboldened to do the same. Diversity offices are being downsized, equity audits abandoned, and commitments to inclusive hiring quietly shelved. In this climate, Black women face not only shrinking opportunities in the public sector, but also renewed barriers in the private sector. What makes this especially dangerous is the speed of the unraveling. Progress that took decades, often clawed through lawsuits, protests, and advocacy, is being rolled back in a matter of years. The scaffolding of protections and opportunities that once gave Black women a fighting chance is collapsing, leaving little to catch them as they fall. This is why unemployment has surged not randomly, but predictably. Trump's policies have targeted the structures that mattered most for Black women, pulling threads until the fabric itself began to tear. It is not the invisible hand of the market at work, it is the visible hand of political decision-making, reshaping the landscape in ways that disproportionately harm one group. But the numbers and policies only tell part of the story. Behind every statistic is a human reality. What happens to communities when their most reliable breadwinners lose jobs en masse? What happens when an entire demographic, long forced to fight twice as hard for half as much, suddenly finds the few ladders of opportunity disappearing? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When policies strip away jobs and protections, the consequences don't stay confined to employment statistics. They seep into kitchens, classrooms, and corner stores. The wave of unemployment among Black women is not just a professional setback, it is a cascading crisis that reshapes entire communities. And unlike the broad job losses of recessions past, this crisis has a sharp, disproportionate edge. It targets the very group most responsible for keeping Black households afloat. For many Black families, women are the primary breadwinners. They juggle not only full-time jobs but also caretaking roles for children, aging parents, and, in many cases, extended family members. When those paychecks vanish, it's not simply one individual losing stability, it's entire family networks thrown into disarray. The stress is immediate. Mortgage payments are missed, grocery bills shrink, and utility shutoff notices begin arriving. The hard truth is that economic loss for Black women ripples faster and cuts deeper precisely because their income is the cornerstone of household survival. Small businesses in Black neighborhoods are among the first to feel the ripple. When steady incomes disappear, discretionary spending dries up. Hair salons, restaurants, daycare centers, and retail shops that rely on a customer base of working-class women suddenly see sales plummet. Owners are forced to cut hours, lay off workers, or close their doors entirely. The loss of federal jobs in Washington or Atlanta translates into empty storefronts and for-lease signs on streets in Baltimore, Detroit, and Jackson. What looks like a personnel cut on a government ledger becomes a neighborhood collapse on the ground. The crisis also reshapes generational expectations. For decades, Black families encouraged their children to pursue federal employment precisely because it offered stability and fairness absent in the private sector. Young graduates now find those pathways blocked. The message this sends to the next generation is devastating. The ladder your parents climbed is being pulled away before you can even grab hold. College graduates returning to their communities without work opportunities face mounting student debt, stalled careers, and a deepening sense of hopelessness. Churches and community organizations, often the safety nets of last resort, are being stretched to their limits. Food pantries report record demand. Housing assistance programs face long waiting lists. Mental health counselors speak of rising stress, depression, and anxiety among Black women who feel betrayed by a system that once promised stability. These aren't isolated anecdotes. They are part of a national pattern, where the stripping away of economic opportunity directly translates into greater social strain. The cultural impact is equally profound. Federal jobs once served not only as financial lifelines, but also as symbols of dignity and belonging. They allowed Black women to envision themselves as contributors to the nation, not just outsiders scraping for survival. The erosion of these roles under Trump does more than shrink bank accounts. It chips away at identity. It tells a workforce that has fought tooth and nail for recognition that their presence was never valued, only tolerated until deemed expendable. Perhaps most striking is the widening gap between Black communities and broader American narratives of recovery. While some sectors celebrate gains in stock markets or modest job growth, the story on the ground in Black neighborhoods is one of survival, not success. Pressley's warning that this is not just an economic issue but a moral one rings loud here. Families forced into instability are being asked to bear the costs of policies they did not design, while the benefits accrue elsewhere. The toll is undeniable, but the question now looms: how much of this crisis is being tracked, acknowledged, or addressed by the institutions tasked with ensuring fairness? If families are struggling at this scale, then what responsibility does the Federal Reserve, America's most powerful economic watchdog, have to intervene? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The crisis unfolding in Black households raises an uncomfortable question. Who is responsible for making sure that America's economic recovery reaches everyone? For Representative Ayanna Pressley, the answer is clear. The Federal Reserve cannot remain a passive observer while Black women bear the brunt of Trump's economic restructuring. By directing her demand to Fed Chair Jerome Powell, she has placed the central bank squarely at the center of this battle. The Federal Reserve's mandate sounds simple: keep inflation stable and promote maximum employment. But in practice, that second responsibility has often been treated as a broad, faceless statistic. Policymakers tout job growth in aggregate terms, rarely disclosing how those gains or losses are distributed across racial and gender lines. Pressley's challenge cuts to the heart of this habit. She argues that averages conceal inequality, and when the disparities are as glaring as they are now, the Fed's silence is nothing short of complicity. Her demand is not just for acknowledgement, but for transparency and accountability. She wants the Fed to release detailed demographic data, not simply headline unemployment rates. By disaggregating the numbers, policymakers and the public can see the reality. While one group may experience steady employment, another may be falling into economic despair. Without this level of visibility, Black women's unemployment can be hidden behind national averages that suggest progress. For Pressley, that is an unacceptable erasure. But her pressure goes deeper than data. She is also asking what strategies the Federal Reserve intends to adopt to address these disparities. The central bank has levers that influence hiring, wages, and credit access. Its monetary policy decisions, like setting interest rates, shape the environment for businesses to expand or contract. If the Fed can respond aggressively to Wall Street's turbulence, Pressley argues, then it can and must respond to a jobs crisis hitting Black communities. This demand also has a symbolic weight. The Federal Reserve has long been viewed as insulated from politics, but Pressley is shattering that illusion by framing its inaction as a political choice. To ignore the racialized dimensions of unemployment is not neutrality. It is alignment with policies that perpetuate inequality. By calling Powell to account, she forces him to choose. Will the Fed recognize that maximum employment must apply to everyone, or will it continue treating Black women's exclusion as collateral damage? The move also reflects a broader shift in how economic justice is framed within American politics. For decades, discussions about the Fed's role rarely addressed race. Employment was seen in aggregate, as though everyone experienced the economy in the same way. Pressley's intervention challenges that orthodoxy. She insists that the central bank cannot afford to be blind to systemic discrimination, because its silence sustains the very inequalities it claims not to govern. This is a high-stakes confrontation. If Powell acknowledges the disparities, it sets a precedent for the Fed to treat racial inequities as part of its mandate. That would be a groundbreaking shift in U.S. economic policy. If he dismisses the call, it reinforces the perception that institutions are willing to safeguard markets, but not the communities that sustain them. In either case, Pressley has forced the issue into public view, ensuring that the economic pain of Black women is no longer hidden in technical reports. For families already in crisis, this debate is not academic. It determines whether their struggles will be recognized as national priorities or dismissed as statistical noise. It shapes whether policies will be crafted with their realities in mind, or whether they will be left to navigate the fallout alone. Pressley's stand reframes the unemployment surge not as an unfortunate side effect of Trump's cuts, but as a test of whether American institutions are willing to defend those most at risk. And yet, beyond the borders of Washington, another comparison quietly takes shape. While America's most powerful economic institutions are accused of ignoring its most vulnerable citizens, leaders across Africa are showing what it looks like when governments deliberately build structures to protect their people. Could the solutions that America refuses to pursue be found in the strategies now unfolding on the African continent? When Ayanna Pressley calls on the Federal Reserve to recognize the plight of Black women, she is essentially demanding that America live up to its own promises of fairness. But the irony is that while the United States debates whether racial equity belongs in its economic mandate, African nations are actively proving what it means to center people in economic policy. The comparison is as stark as it is instructive. In Africa, governments are laying the groundwork for inclusive growth. The lesson doesn't stop at Burkina Faso. Ethiopia has worked to expand its manufacturing base, drawing on both local labor and strategic foreign partnerships to create industrial parks that employ tens of thousands. Nigeria, despite its challenges, has moved toward leveraging its natural resources, particularly lithium, to fuel domestic industries rather than allowing raw materials to be stripped away by multinational corporations. These policies are rooted in a clear vision. Prosperity cannot be imported. It must be built from within, and it must reach those who have historically been marginalized. For America's Black women, the African model offers a sobering mirror. Imagine if federal policy prioritized stability for the communities most vulnerable to systemic inequities. Imagine if instead of dismantling diversity initiatives, Washington expanded them into engines of opportunity, much like Africa's investment in homegrown industries. The fact that these questions even need to be asked underscores the depth of America's hypocrisy. It preaches inclusivity abroad while practicing dispossession at home. Pressley's call to the Federal Reserve is not just a domestic plea. It is a reminder that global standards are shifting. Nations in Africa are proving that economic sovereignty and inclusivity are not luxuries. They are survival strategies. America, on the other hand, risks showing the world that it cannot even safeguard its own citizens from internal economic sabotage. If the Fed fails to act, it will not only betray Black women, but also expose America as unwilling to meet the very bar of fairness it urges others to reach. The broader implication is clear. The struggle for equity is no longer confined to one nation. It is a global test of values. Will governments prioritize profit margins and political theater? Or will they protect the people whose labor sustains their economies? Africa is beginning to answer that question with boldness and clarity. The United States, by contrast, is hesitating, and so the comparison becomes unavoidable. While Black women in America fight to hold on to shrinking opportunities, African nations are teaching the world that dignity in labor must be non-negotiable. Pressley's battle with the Fed may be unfolding in Washington, but its outcome will echo far beyond America's borders. The question is whether the United States will learn from Africa's example or continue proving that its promises of equity are little more than empty slogans. Do you think the Federal Reserve will ever take racial equity seriously in its mandate? Let us know in the comments section. Are African nations now setting a better example of economic justice than America? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.